The room went quiet in a way policy rooms never do. It wasn't a dramatic silence. No raised voices. No slammed folders. Just a pause, half a second long, where the interpreter stopped speaking. It happened in May 2021, during a closed-door session at a regional development finance forum in Singapore. The topic was supply chain resilience after COVID. Mid-level officials, trade representatives, a handful of central bank observers. Not the kind of meeting that makes headlines. Li Kong, a senior official from China's Ministry of Commerce, was speaking in Mandarin. His slides were in English. Graphs showing shipping lanes, port throughput, semiconductor inputs, rare earth processing capacity. Then he said something that made the interpreter hesitate. I was seated 3 rows back. I understand Mandarin well enough to follow formal policy language. What Li said was simple. We have completed strategic stockpiling. We are now restructuring global flows. What the interpreter said was different. China is considering measures to improve supply chain security in cooperation with international partners. From completion to consideration. From restructuring to improving. From fact to possibility. Most of the room nodded politely. A German trade official typed notes. A World Bank analyst scrolled on her tablet. Someone quietly refilled their coffee. No one reacted. What they heard sounded like every other post-pandemic discussion about resilience and cooperation. Vague, tentative, bureaucratic. What was actually said was a declaration. Something had already been built. And it wasn't just one sentence. Over the next 15 minutes, the same pattern repeated. Li in Mandarin, our rare earth processing capacity now covers over 80% of global refining. Export controls will align with strategic objectives beginning this year. Interpreter in English, China is evaluating regulatory frameworks for critical mineral exports. Li, domestic semiconductor substitution has reached threshold levels in key industrial sectors. Foreign dependency risks are no longer systemic. Interpreter, China is working toward greater self-reliance in advanced manufacturing. Li, we have redirected long-term shipping contracts away from volatile routes. Priority access has been secured for strategic partners. Interpreter, China is exploring logistics cooperation agreements to improve stability. Each time, completed actions became future intentions. I started writing the phrases side by side in my notebook. Completed became considering. Implemented became exploring. Secured became working toward. It wasn't a bad interpreter. Quite the opposite. She was doing what professional diplomatic translation is trained to do, soften direct language, so it doesn't sound confrontational. But the effect was that the room was hearing an entirely different message. When Li said China had already restructured critical supply chains, the room heard that China hoped to improve them someday. When he said controls were already aligned with strategic objectives, the room heard regulatory discussions were ongoing. What should have sounded like a status update sounded like a brainstorming session. After the presentation ended, the moderator thanked Li for his thoughtful vision for future cooperation. Future. In the hallway outside, small groups formed the way they always do after policy sessions. I overheard a French logistics advisor say, China's still talking about resilience. Everyone is. An American trade consultant replied, yeah, but talk is cheap. Rebuilding supply chains takes decades. A Singaporean banker added, they want to reduce dependency, but it's not realistic at scale. Not one person mentioned stockpiles. Not one person mentioned export controls. Not one person mentioned that shipping contracts had already been redirected. The entire conversation treated Li's remarks as aspirational. Later that afternoon, I sat with an economist I knew from a multilateral development agency. What did you think of China's presentation? I asked. He shrugged. Standard stuff. Everyone wants resilient supply chains now. It's mostly policy language. Did you catch when he said they've already completed strategic stockpiling? He frowned. He said they were considering resilience measures. I opened my notebook and showed him the Mandarin phrasing. His eyes narrowed slightly. That's not what we heard, he said. I know. Even then, he didn't look alarmed. Even if they've stockpiled some materials, restructuring global supply chains is incredibly complex, he said. Market forces don't move on command. It was the same assumption I'd heard for years. China announces ambitious goals. Implementation is slow. Structural constraints win. So when statements sound bold, they must be aspirations. The softened translation fit perfectly with that belief. But what if they weren't goals? What if they were progress reports? Because when Li spoke in Mandarin, he wasn't describing what China hoped to do after COVID. He was describing what had already been done during it. Stockpiles built quietly over 18 months. Shipping capacity locked in with long-term contracts. Processing infrastructure expanded while global attention focused on lockdowns. None of it announced with fanfare. None of it debated publicly. Just executed. And in that room, almost no one realized it. Over the following weeks, I paid closer attention at similar meetings, ASEAN trade forums, development bank briefings, commodity policy panels. The same translation pattern appeared again and again. Chinese officials spoke in terms of completed phases, operational systems, and implemented controls. English audiences heard pilot programs, discussions, and future plans. Direct language became collaborative language. Implementation became intention. What this created wasn't misunderstanding in the usual sense. It created delay. By the time Western policymakers realized certain systems were already in place, they treated them as sudden moves. Export restrictions appeared to come out of nowhere. Supply chain dominance seemed to materialize overnight. Strategic leverage looked like a surprise. But in Mandarin rooms, timelines had been discussed for years, and I kept thinking back to that moment in Singapore. The half-second pause. The sentence that shifted from completed to considering. The room that nodded calmly instead of leaning forward. Because that wasn't just a translation issue. It was the first sign that two sides were operating on entirely different understandings of what was already real. 3 months after that meeting in Singapore, the first export restriction was announced. It was framed as routine, an adjustment to licensing requirements for certain rare earth materials used in advanced batteries and precision magnets. The official English statement emphasized environmental compliance and sustainable resource management. The Mandarin statement was more direct. Supply security priorities have shifted. Allocation will reflect strategic national objectives. Allocation, not evaluation. Not discussion, allocation. Western coverage described it as a warning shot, a signal, a pressure tactic. But if you had listened carefully in May, it wasn't a warning at all. It was phase 2. By late summer, manufacturers in Germany and South Korea were quietly reporting longer delivery timelines for certain processed minerals. Nothing dramatic. Just delays, backlogs, administrative review periods that stretch from days into weeks. In Washington, a Senate subcommittee held hearings on supply chain vulnerability. Experts testified that dependency on concentrated processing capacity posed long-term risks. Long-term. The word appeared repeatedly. But the shift wasn't long-term. It was current. I returned to my notes from Singapore. Li had used a phrase that stood out at the time. Jigu yijing tia xing. The structure has already been adjusted. Not will be. Not is being. Has been. In English, that sentence had become a sentence about exploring stability frameworks. In Mandarin, it was an update. The more I reviewed public speeches from Chinese trade and industry officials, the more consistent the pattern became. September 2021, a commodities forum in Shanghai. Mandarin. Domestic strategic reserves are sufficient to stabilize priority industries for extended disruptions. English summary. China aims to enhance resilience against potential supply shocks. November 2021, a Belt and Road Logistics Summit. Mandarin. Alternative maritime corridors are operational. Redundancy is no longer theoretical. English summary. China is working to diversify trade routes. Operational became working. Redundancy became diversification. In policy language, those shifts matter. Because operational means contract signed, infrastructure built, capacity tested. Working suggests a committee. By early 2022, semiconductor equipment exports into China were facing new scrutiny from Western regulators. The narrative in Washington and Brussels was that pressure would constrain Chinese manufacturing capacity. Yet at a regional manufacturing expo in Chengdu that March, a provincial official said something unusual. We anticipated tightening cycles. Substitution benchmarks were met ahead of schedule. The English language recap described it as confidence in future domestic innovation. But the Mandarin phrasing again used the past tense. Met, benchmarks met. When policymakers assume you are trying, they discount you. When they realize you have finished, the leverage has shifted. That spring, a European auto manufacturer quietly rerouted procurement contracts to secondary suppliers outside China, fearing disruption. Within 6 months, those alternative suppliers faced their own shortages of processed inputs. Because the bottleneck wasn't extraction, it was refinement. And refinement capacity had been consolidated years earlier. This wasn't a secret. China had published 5-year industrial plans detailing expansion targets in critical materials processing. Investment numbers were public. Construction milestones were documented in provincial reports. But tone matters. When strategic language is softened into cooperative language, urgency dissipates. And without urgency, response slows. In October 2022, at a trade ministers' roundtable in Geneva, a U.S. representative expressed concern about the weaponization of supply chains. The Chinese delegate responded calmly in Mandarin, "Tools are tools. Stability requires balance. We have ensured balance within our jurisdiction." The English translation rendered it as support for mutually beneficial trade relations. Mutually beneficial. The phrase landed softly in the room. No one asked what ensuring balance meant. In Mandarin bureaucratic usage, ensuring balance often implies administrative control mechanisms already in place. By early 2023, data from shipping analytics firms showed that a higher percentage of container throughput in certain Asian ports was tied to long-term contracts rather than the spot markets. In Mandarin briefings, officials had spoken about anchoring capacity for strategic resilience. In English coverage, it was described as improving efficiency. At a development finance conference in Kuala Lumpur that April, a Southeast Asian minister commented privately that Chinese financing terms for infrastructure projects increasingly included clauses tied to material sourcing, guaranteed processing access, contingency allocations during disruptions. When I asked whether this had been recently introduced, he shook his head. "It's been in the contracts for years," he said. "We just didn't pay attention, not because it was hidden, because it sounded procedural. Procedural language rarely triggers alarm, but procedures determine outcomes." Meanwhile, Western policy discussions focus heavily on reshoring and friendshoring strategies. Reports projected timelines stretching 5 to 10 years to rebuild domestic processing ecosystems. 5 to 10 years. The same time frame Lee had outlined for phase completion in Singapore. The difference was that his timeline had already begun 18 months earlier. When Western analysts described China as accelerating unexpectedly, they were reacting to visibility, not velocity. Visibility had been delayed by interpretation. Velocity had not, and I kept returning to a simple observation. In Mandarin, the language of implementation is precise. Planning, preparation, pilot, execution, completion. Each stage has distinct terminology. In English diplomatic translation, those distinctions often compress into being developed or under consideration. Compression removes stage clarity. Without stage clarity, you cannot gauge proximity. And without gauging proximity, you cannot calibrate response. So when export controls tightened further in mid-2023 and certain shipments required extended review periods, Western media framed it as escalation. Escalation implies departure. But departure from what? If the restructuring had already occurred, if the contracts had already been redirected, if substitution benchmarks had already been met, then the controls were not escalation. They were activation. And activation only looks sudden if you believe the system was still under construction. By the end of 2023, the narrative in Western capitals had shifted. What had once been framed as gradual policy evolution was now described as strategic coercion. Briefings use words like leverage, choke points, and economic statcraft. Yet when I reviewed the Mandarin transcripts of Chinese industrial and trade forums from the previous 5 years, none of what was happening appeared sudden. The sequence had been methodical. First, capacity concentration. Second, redundancy elimination. Third, contract anchoring. Fourth, substitution readiness. Only then came administrative control. In Western policy models, leverage is often imagined as a switch. Pressure turned on during conflict. In Mandarin bureaucratic language, leverage is built quietly long before it is needed. This difference in conception mattered. Because when Western analysts ask, why is China doing this now? The more accurate question was, why are we only noticing now? In January 2024, a logistics intelligence firm released a report showing that over 60% of global rare earth processing output was tied to Chinese-controlled facilities, with a majority locked into long-term supply commitments. The coverage framed it as consolidation. But consolidation had happened years earlier. The report simply made it visible. At a closed workshop in Brussels that spring, European trade officials discussed accelerating alternative processing projects in Scandinavia and Eastern Europe. The timelines projected operational capacity by 2029. One advisor quietly remarked, "We are racing a train that left the station half a decade ago." No one contradicted him. The assumption that market forces would naturally dilute concentration had proven wrong. Market forces have flowed towards scale, subsidies, and regulatory predictability. And those had existed in one place. In Mandarin language policy discussions, officials often use the phrase jichu xiezi, foundational layout. It refers to the underlying architecture that determines how flows move once pressure is applied. Ports, processing plants, contract structures, payment terms, logistics corridors. Foundational layout is not about immediate influence. It is about future optionality. Once the layout is built, responses become administrative rather than strategic. Forms replace negotiations. Approvals replace diplomacy. Delays replace sanctions. By mid-2024, several multinational manufacturers reported that securing alternative sources for certain process inputs would take 3 to 5 years at minimum, not because materials were scarce, because refining capacity was. The distinction had always existed. Extraction is dispersed. Processing is concentrated. Chinese officials had spoken about this openly for over a decade. But when framed in English as improving industrial efficiency, it sounded like ordinary development. In Mandarin, it was described as controlling the middle of the value chain. The middle is where leverage lives. At a regional economic forum in Hanoi in June, a Vietnamese trade official described how infrastructure financing agreements increasingly bundled logistics, material sourcing, and processing guarantees into single packages. It wasn't framed as dependence. It was framed as reliability, guaranteed inputs, predictable pricing, insulated supply during disruptions. For fast-growing economies, that stability was attractive. For policymakers in Washington, it looked like influence spreading suddenly. But the contracts had been signed years earlier. Influence wasn't spreading. It was activating. Meanwhile, Western governments announced subsidy programs to rebuild domestic processing industries. Press releases spoke about historic investments. Tens of billions allocated, factories planned, workforces trained. Yet even optimistic projections placed meaningful output several years away, years during which the existing architecture would continue operating. And architecture determines default flows. Once flows are established, changing them is expensive, sometimes politically impossible. At a policy dinner in London, a former trade negotiator summarized it plainly. We treated their statements as ambition. They treated them as schedules. That sentence stayed with me. Ambition invites debate. Schedules invite preparation. Debate consumes time. Preparation compounds advantage. Looking back at the Singapore meeting, the warning hadn't been hidden. It had been softened. Not by deception. By convention. Diplomatic language values harmony. Directness is often filtered out to avoid friction. But friction is also information. When assertive implementation language is translated into cooperative aspiration language, the signal strength drops. And when signal strength drops, urgency fades. I review recordings from other international forums, World Economic Conferences, regional trade summits, development bank panels. Again and again, Chinese officials use precise stage language. Infrastructure completed. Pilot phase concluded. Operational thresholds reached. Control mechanisms activated. In November 2024, a comprehensive trade review released by a major Western economic bloc included a line that stood out. Supply chain concentration risks have materialized faster than anticipated. Materialize, the word implied surprise. Yet nothing about the shift had been abrupt. It had only become visible. The review outlined dependency levels that now constrain industrial planning, delayed clean energy transitions, and complicated defense procurement. It spoke of urgent diversification, accelerated investment, and emergency stockpiling. Emergency, the same word Li had quietly avoided years earlier. Because when China had built its reserves, it hadn't called them emergency measures. It had called them completed strategic preparation. That difference in framing revealed everything. One side had prepared in advance. The other was reacting in real time. In a closed briefing that winter, a senior European official admitted that alternative processing capacity would not meaningfully offset concentration until the early 2030s. We're rebuilding what they finished building years ago, he said. The room was quiet, not in shock, in recognition that leverage had not appeared overnight. It had been assembled patiently, piece by piece. While the global conversation focused on tariffs, speeches, and public disputes, the real work had happened in contracts, infrastructure, and regulatory design. And much of it had been communicated, just not heard the same way. I thought again about that moment in Singapore. The interpreter's pause. The sentence that shifted from completed to considering. The nods around the room. What had sounded like another cooperative discussion had actually been a status update on a system already in place. Not a proposal. A notification. In Mandarin policy culture, that distinction is clear. Announcements of finished phases signal readiness for the next stage. They are not invitations for feedback. They are markers of progress. In English diplomatic culture, softening language signals openness, negotiation, and uncertainty. When those two systems met through translation, clarity dissolved. And in the space where clarity should have been, assumptions rushed in. Assumptions that concentration would naturally unwind. Assumptions that implementation would be slow. Assumptions that ambitious plans were mostly symbolic. Those assumptions shaped response timelines. By the time the outcomes contradicted them, the structural groundwork was complete. The leverage points were embedded in everyday commercial flows. Nothing dramatic was required to activate them. Just administrative steps, paperwork, approvals, delays, the quiet mechanisms of a system already built. The miswarning wasn't about deception. It wasn't about secrecy. It wasn't about hidden plans. It was about how meaning shifts when filtered through convention. How tone changes perception. How tense changes reality. A completed system sounds harmless when described as a future goal. A timeline sounds flexible when described as a vision. And leverage sounds theoretical when described as cooperation. By the time the effects become visible, the construction phase is long over. What remains is operation. I still remember that half second when the interpreter stopped. The moment where two versions of reality briefly overlap. What China said, what the room heard, and the space between them. That space wasn't empty. It filled with assumptions. Those assumptions shaped years of policy, and years later shaped the landscape everyone was now scrambling to adapt to. In geopolitics, warnings are not always loud. Sometimes they arrive calmly. in status updates, in completed phases, in matter-of-fact sentences. And sometimes the most consequential shift isn't what is announced. It's what is already finished. The missed warning wasn't that China was planning to change the system. It was that the system had already changed. While much of the world was still listening for proposals, China had been reporting progress. And by the time that progress became impossible to ignore, it was no longer a plan. It was the new reality,